Hey, Marty,
Hi,
thanks so
Joanne.
much. Thanks so much for wanting to do this for our students. So what I'm hoping that you would talk about is your educational path, like
Mhm.
how you went through Cabrillo, and then I know you went to UCSC. So let's start with the educational path.
Okay,
Okay.
so it's a long and twisted path. I'll say that. I actually started, I went to college at Western Michigan University for 2 years in 1978 and 79. I was on the management path at, WMU, and I, I decided to take a break after 2 years. It wasn't dropping out, but in the end, it was a long time before I got back to school. So I left Michigan and moved to California, moved to Santa Cruz, and was always thinking of getting back to school, but I got a job at a local printing company, worked there for a few years, and then became the manager of that place, and then part owner. So I fell into this and worked there for 5 or 6 years with the thought that I've got to get back to school. I don't want to be a printer my entire life, but things were going well, so I stuck to it. Then, after being there for several years in the late '80s, I started taking classes at Cabrillo, um, and I wound up working at Cabrillo at the same time. I worked in the audiovisual department, and I got an associate's degree in electronics at Cabrillo. I don't believe Carl Stansel is still there, but Carl was there, and Carl was great. I really liked learning from Carl and Mike. I forget Mike's last name, but great department. I learned a lot. And so I left Cabrillo with an associate's degree. And at that point, I started working at a laptop computer battery establishment. So this was a startup. I was the fifth person hired, and this was Portable Energy Products, where, by the way, it was the first place I met and worked with a gentleman named Jamie Thompson, a fine gentleman named Jamie Thompson, of whom you may be aware.
Who happens to be my husband, you guys.
Yes, that's right. So that was actually my first experience in software development. Was it Portable Energy Products? So I can tell you this story if you want to hear the story of how I got involved in this. So I was the fifth person hired. We were developing a lead acid battery for a laptop computer, and my job there at the time, it was very low tech, and I was using a voltmeter to measure the battery and writing down these numbers in a notebook. That's as low tech as you can get. And at some point, the owner, Larry Miller, decided to take a Pascal book home over the weekend and learn to write a program that would measure the voltage of the battery. And he came back in on Monday, and he had this little program that he had written. And so, and this is really going to date me, because the program was running on an old IBM XT or some computer that had no hard drive. It just had a floppy drive, and we were storing data to this thing every 6 minutes, every 1/10 of an hour. So in order to get the data off the disk, I would wait for the data to be stored, grab the floppy, run across the hall to the reception desk where we had a computer that did have a hard drive, put it in there. And I had to get it back across the hall and put it back in, because if they tried to store the next data point 6 minutes later, the program crashed. So I spent a few days running this back and forth across the hall and thinking, well, this is silly. And I went to Larry and said, can't you just tell your program to try to store the data? And if it doesn't do it, just throw that data point away and then, try again later. And Larry said, that's a good idea, but he was flying somewhere to get some kind of funding that afternoon. He'd be gone a week. So he said, you do it. And he handed me, this disk, and I said, I don't know anything about programming. And he said, well, then here's the book. Take the book home that I just read and you do it. So anyway, I took the book home. I learned, what his program did and how to fix it. And then I sort of got hooked into it, where, over time, over the years that I was at that company, we went from testing one battery to testing a little rack of 25 of these batteries, and then an entire 32 stations of 25 batteries, and then a room full of these things. And so each time we made that change, I had to go into that software and, change it so that it would work with the new system. And I was also managing probably 30 people at the time that were coming in to make these batteries as this company grew. But what I found was what I really enjoyed most of all was just playing around with the software. So I left Portable Energy Products after a few years and went across the street to Seagate, where I had a job testing preamp. So I was still doing hardware, but I also had to write C++ code for writing test harness and running tests. And once again, I found that part of my job was what I really enjoyed. Part of the deal that I got when I went to Seagate was that I could go back to school during the day, work at night and have a very flexible schedule. So at that point, I knew I wanted to go back to school, and I started going to UCSC as an old student. Now I'm like late 20s, early 30s, and I'm going to school with, I'm by far the oldest student there. So I went to UCSC. I got my computer science degree. Let's see. Is this what you're wanting to hear, Joanne? Is there anything?
Yeah, no, this is great. I love stories. I want to hear what your
Okay.
path is, because
Okay.
students are trying to determine what their path is. And
Right.
this is resonating with students that are on a similar path,
Okay. All right.
Okay. So, okay. So then, yeah, great. Okay. So then you got your BA, right, in computer
Yes,
science
I did.
from UCSC. And how was your experience at Cabrillo or UCSC? I mean, it was a while back. Do you remember?
Yeah, I do remember. I really enjoyed my time at Cabrillo. As I said, Carl Stansel was a guy that I really respected, and he was a great teacher. So in getting the associate's degree, I was a little bit older than everybody at that point, but not necessarily. There were a lot of students. We were taking night courses as well. So you would find, more students who weren't just right out of high school at that point. But that was a great experience. Going to UCSC was another great experience. It was hard for me at the time because I was working 30 to 40 hours a week at Seagate while taking full-time classes. So that was kind of insane. I wouldn't recommend to be going to school full-time and working full-time. But luckily, at some point after about 2 years at Seagate, the entire team got laid off. There were like 40 of us, and they laid us all off, which was a blessing for me, because then I could just go to school for my last 2 or 3 semesters. And that was really enjoyable. I really enjoyed, being at UCSC. Some of the courses that I remember taking that I found really interesting were, abstract data types and the analysis of algorithms. I found that stuff to be really interesting. Doesn't necessarily apply to what I've done since, but I found that was, really fun.
Okay, so then after you got the bachelor's degree in computer science, then where did you work? And then let's talk about that till present day.
Okay, so at that point,
companies and the positions.
Yeah, so at that point, I had the degree. I got a job at Borland in Scotts Valley. I was hired as what they called at the time an SQE engineer, software quality engineering, and I was hired to write tests for the Delphi and C++ builder projects, development tools, which at least at the time that I was there, which was in the late 90s, where Delphi was a fairly large product, very successful, Borland was kind of a competitor to Microsoft for those tools at the time. So I got there right at the peak. I remember my job was to write tests for the Delphi runtime library and also for the visual component library. And we developed, let's see, the test framework to drive the UI. And that was fun. I enjoyed that. I did that for a few years. And after a couple of years being a test engineer, I took over as manager of the team. So not long after being a programmer, a test programmer, I went into management. And I've been managing either test teams or development teams ever since, at one place or another. So I was at Borland for, I think, 12 years. And left there after having gone through multiple layoffs. I think I probably had been involved in 10 layoffs. And as a manager, that's a really hard thing to do. If you have one layoff in a company and you have to let somebody go and you have a large team, there's usually somebody who isn't really into what they're doing who might just benefit from, just having a change of scenery. Once you get to your second layoff or a third, you have people that are just committed to what they're doing. They do great work, and it's not an easy thing to do. So after being there for a long time and watching Borland, slowly go down and down, I knew it was time to go. I got an offer to come to Oracle. I had resisted those offers before because I did not want to drive over the hill to work. I wanted to stay, on this side of the hill. But eventually, it seemed like the right thing to do. So this is now probably 8 or 9 years ago. I came to Oracle in Santa Clara. I was responsible for managing the Java deployment team, a team of about, we had about 8 or 10 developers. Some were in Santa Clara, some were on the East Coast. And I did that for a few years. Then I got involved in a startup project for a project called the Advanced Management Console, which was a commercial offering so that companies could manage their Java distributions. I worked with that team for a couple of years, then moved over to the JVM team where I am now, where I'm managing, I have 10 direct reports that are either working on Java serviceability or JVM serviceability or the JVM runtime. Really brilliant developers. And I think now I've landed in a place now where everyone that works for me has been doing what they're doing for 10, 20, 25 years. And they're working on parts of the code that I would never touch. So when you get to this point as a manager, you have to realize that, every meeting that you call that you're in, you are the dumbest person in the room. You just, they all know a lot more than you do, and you have to learn to accept that and, provide as much value as you can. But that's where I am now. I work with some great people, some brilliant people. We do have some young people, but they are also brilliant, which is why they're there. So this is where I am now. I like it.
Could you talk about, it sounds like maybe you were a little reluctant to move into management, maybe? I'm not sure if
Yes,
I remember that correctly. Could you talk
I
about that, like the difference of staying the engineer, staying the programmer versus moving to management? The advantages and disadvantages?
Yeah. I mean, I never really wanted to be in management. When I was at Western Michigan University all those years ago, I was on a management track. And I kind of dropped out because I didn't think I wanted to be in management. Then I went to the printing shop and started managing. I guess, I grew to love it. I really do like, when I'm working with a team, when you're managing people, you have to, I don't think really a cheerleader is the right word. You're not a cheerleader, but you're trying to be an advocate for them all the time and, promote their careers. you have to keep, I mean, I can't possibly know at the code level what everyone who works for me is doing, but I have to know at some level. So, so I think one struggle that I have is to try to keep up technically as much as I need to for this job. I think it's really just a personality type. There are people who work for me that I think would be great managers who have been developers for many, many years. And when I ask them, they just say, absolutely not. I wouldn't have your job in any way. They don't want to do it. I think people don't want to deal with, the bureaucracy that you might have to run into. So they tend to say no. I like it because I like to be a shield for the people who work for me and shield them from the noise from above. I think, really what helps for me is that I've been lucky to have great managers myself. If I had an overbearing manager who was unreasonable and micromanaged me and my team, I may not like being a middle manager as I am right now. But I've been lucky. I have a great manager now. I've had 2 managers at Oracle, both great people. And going back to Borland, it was the same way. I just worked with a lot of great people, and that makes a huge difference. So, yeah.
Let me just interject for a minute. You mentioned Borland again, and I've mentioned to many students that I found Carl at a party of my friends. So I wanted everybody to know that Marty is the one who gave the party where I met Carl.
I'll be darned. Is that true?
Yes. Okay,
Well,
so let's, anyway.
Carl is a great guy too.
Yeah,
we worked together for a few years.
Yeah. Okay, so then I guess the last 2 questions are, how did your technical bachelor's degree impact your life or the quality of life? And like, what experiences do you have now because of that? That's your first question.
How it impacted my life? Well, it's been nothing but a positive thing. I mean, I've been able to, my entire career, do something that I really love. It's given me a lot of flexibility. I've stayed for a long time at every job I've been in, but there are a lot of opportunities. If I was having a bad experience, there are plenty of other jobs out there, and I could have gone wherever. Certainly over time, I've worked with a lot of people who have left the companies I'm in, but I've kept those friendships and those relationships. So right now, if I decided, to leave Oracle, I would have 10 other places that I could call and say, hey, what's going on there? And, could probably get a job. So there is the flexibility angle. At the same time, for me, it's just, I do work well and enjoy working with a bunch of really dedicated people. And at every job I've been in, people are, really enthusiastic about what they're doing. They love what they're doing, and it makes it really easy to manage them, and it makes it fun to go to work. I think, one thing that I enjoyed about programming right away was that it was the kind of job where, you would start working on something, you're trying to solve some puzzle as opposed to working. It didn't feel like work. And instead of staring at the clock and going, oh God, it's only 2 o'clock, I've got 3 more hours here, you would look up and it's 5:30 and you go, oh my God, the day's done. It was a different feel. So that was important to me, to not be, bored with what I'm doing. And I'm never bored with it. It's always a challenge to keep up. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks. And then the last question is, since beginning engineering students or computer science students will be watching this video, and it could be people coming straight from high school or changing careers or doing what you did, where they started working and found something they love, what would be some maybe suggestions or things that you would give them to like be able to move along the path?
I would say if you have a passion for programming, don't wait for the job. Start writing code somewhere. There are a whole lot of open source projects that you can get involved in. Find a technology you're interested in, find an open source project, join that project and start, contributing by fixing bugs, whatever it can be, or just, reviewing other people's code. I think, working on projects on your own is important. When I'm trying to hire somebody and I'm looking at resumes, I'm not necessarily looking for, just a list of what you did at your previous job, or, what you did at some school project. It's more important to me to find out, what are you passionate about, right? Doesn't have to be programming, but if it is, what did you work on your own, and what did you actually finish, as opposed to just a trail of things that you were told to do and you did. Usually I ask people, what do you do for fun outside of work? I'm looking for some pattern of passion for something, for anything. And if I find people that are passionate about something, I feel like I can transfer that passion, to our company and our projects. So find something you like to do and go off and do it. Also, I think if you're, if you're a woman trying to get in this position right now, I think this is the time to do it. This is a male-dominated industry, but companies are really doing what they can to find female candidates for jobs these days. Right now, there's a big push at Oracle, for diversity and inclusion. For example, over the last couple of years, every job rec that I send out, I have to send the text on to a group that looks for gender bias, or regional bias or age bias, and they send it back, with tips on how to remove those things, because they really are trying to find people, for jobs that aren't just men. So I think it's a great thing. So.
And something that I'm always talking to engineering students about is like, it's all about creativity. Yeah, you use your math and science, but the idea of creativity, and you work in teams, and the more diversity, whether it's age or ethnicity or whatever gender, the more life experiences people bring, more different things to the table, and then you could come up with more creative ideas. So
Exactly.
it's really awesome.
It's important to have different life experiences and different viewpoints in every meeting you're in. It really helps.
Yeah. All right, Marty. Well, thanks so much for being willing to do this.
Oh, no problem, Joanne.
Yeah.
Nice to see you, and tell Carl I love him.
Okay, I will. I will. Okay, see ya. Bye.